happy that all of you are in of crimes against humanity, and there's a lot of things we can clear up. Oh, I was supposed to tell you about myself. So my name is Darryl Robinson. I'm a professor from Canada. I used to work in the Canadian government as a lawyer, and I worked a lot on crimes against humanity. I worked at the court. Now I'm a professor. Crimes against humanity is a thing I focus on a lot. Have done amicus curiae work and so on. Well, we'll come back to that. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, is about just the idea of crimes against humanity and some of the debates that are had. The Mexico context is an interesting one because it raises a lot of questions about what are the limits of a crime against humanity. I'm not an expert on the Mexican context. I've read a lot about it and I'm fascinated by it, but there will be a panel, or there'll be a discussion after this where there will be people better suited to try to apply some of these concepts to the context here, which is going to be fascinating. So the big points that I'm going to cover, one is just to introduce to you the basic test for what is a crime against humanity. Then I want to talk about this idea of compartments. There's a reality that a lot of international criminal lawyers, including myself, would have, which is, oh, Mexico, that's drug-related violence, therefore not a crime against humanity. And I ask, are there really two separate compartments, or could it be both? Then there's a question coming up about what kinds of organizations can commit crimes against humanity. We know that states can do it, but what about organized crime or groups like that? So that's an issue. And then the fourth issue, which is a hard one, at the moment, the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court Statute, it asks for a policy or organization. This is a very controversial word and a confusing word. So we have to figure out what might that mean and what does it require and how do you prove it and so on. Those are the big points I want to talk about. Okay, so starting up with the basic points, just the big picture of it. A crime against humanity involves kinds of acts in context. The acts can be murder, torture, sexual enforcement, acts like that, and they have to be committed in a particular context. The context is that it's part of a widespread or systematic attack directed at any civilian population. So let's look at the pieces of it. Especially I'm going to talk to you about this idea of a wide, what does that mean? So it has all these words in it. So first of all, it's about the scale and the number of victims. So it's just the size of it. Typically, any situation that has thousands, even there's no magic number for what constitutes widespread, but thousands easily qualifies as widespread. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Then the other possibility is systematic. Systematic means that there's patterns in the crime, that there's a high degree of organization. Is not set down perfectly, but that's the basic idea, is was it thoroughly organized by somebody? And there's factors that we look at, repetition of similar events, the same kinds of perpetrators, they're all agents of the state or they're all agents of the organization. They keep going after the same kinds of victims, same kind of methods, they put a lot of resources into it. You could see some political objectives. None of those things requirements, they're just variables. My speed, is this speed I'm talking with is good? Yeah? Okay. So that's one part, widespread or systematic. Then there's this idea of a civilian population. What that really, not against a military target. I don't think that will be a particular issue in this context, whether it's a military target. The key thing about that is the word any, actually, any civilian population. That was a radical idea after World War II, in Nuremberg, when crimes against humanity was new, was any civilian population, meaning even if a state was attacking its own people, that was a legitimate concern for the international community. So that's the key word there, is enemy. There's some issues tucked inside there that we'll talk about in a moment. What if the state says, well, my purpose was fighting crime? What do we do with that? And if there's time at the end, I might come back to the question of, do we need to define the population? There's some new cases saying you have to define the population. I don't think it's necessary. I don't know if we'll have time to get to that in this, but maybe after the break we can talk about that. So where it all starts, though, is the first thing you need is an attack directed against a civilian population. And the attack is complicated because in the Rome Statute, at least, the International Criminal Court Statute, it says there has to be a state or organizational, a really controversial requirement. Not all the instruments require it. What it means is there has to be something connecting the crimes. It's not enough that you just have a lot of crimes. They have to somehow be connected. That's what that's trying to get at. But the questions we can talk about include what counts as a state organization, and also how would you prove this idea of a policy? How would you go about proving that? So I wanted to talk about this. Why does the Rome Statute have this requirement of state organizational policy? And it's complicated, and I think it's going to come up a lot in this case. The idea behind it is that widespread crime by itself is not enough to make a crime against humanity. If you just have widespread crime, that can happen anywhere if they're not united somehow. South Africa these days has thousands and thousands of murders every year. It's just a whole lot of individual murders. It's just a lot of crime. In fact, every country has thousands of crimes, so they have to be linked together somehow to be. What's interesting, though, is the Mexico situation. The easy would be one, the state itself is attacking lots and lots of people. Clearly, that's connected. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a whole bunch of individuals all committing their own crimes. That's just crime. In between scenarios, if you have a whole lot of different entities all committing a medium amount of crimes, that's murky. So that's something we'll talk about. Yeah, the idea that everyone, the policy element is controversial, but the thing that everybody agrees on is that random acts of individuals acting on their own personal criminal plans, this person commits a murder, this person commits a robbery, and they're all not connected, that's definitely not a crime against humanity. I personally, I believe in the policy element. I think it's a good idea, but it does cause headaches. I think all it is taking that proposition that everybody agrees. A crime against humanity is random acts of individuals acting on their own initiatives. It's the same thing. If it's not just individuals, what is it? Else, organizations. So that somehow link it to states or organizations. So let's see. So the structure of crimes against humanity is regrettably complicated, and I feel bad about that. I have to confess, I didn't put in my bio, but which causes headaches and is really confusing. I have a hand. I'd like to apologize to the world. It is complicated. In particular, what's complicated has this. You have to prove an attack against a civilian population. That requires that there at least be multiple crimes. We're not going to worry about that because that's not even an issue. Then you have to show this policy, meaning there's multiple crimes happening and they're somehow connected to a state or organization. That's your attack. Once you prove that, you have to it's widespread or it's systematic. So it's because you have here the word policy and then you have the word systematic, and people say, aren't those the same thing? Because if they are, then the test is contradictory. So I think crimes against humanity are crimes that scale plus some sort of, always need a little bit of both. Some scale, some collectivity. You can connect it to a state or organization. A lot of scale, it's widespread. You can show thousands. or it's systematic, it's highly organized. So that's how it works. And again, I apologize for how complicated that provision is. And if you didn't fully follow what I just did there, that's okay. So now talking about this idea of compartments. I have to say, in 2006, when someone first suggested to me that the Mexico situation could affect humanity, it was, my initial reaction was perplexed. Because everyone knows that Mexico is facing, it's drug-related violence. There's violence committed by the state trying to fight that. So it sounds like a compartment. In the heads of lots of lawyers, you go, no, that's drug-related violence, that's a different thing. But are they separate compartments? So here I put them up as completely separate things, but the other possibility is maybe they can overlap. Maybe things can be both. In fact, with respect to terrorism, most lawyers agree that something can be both terrorism and a crime. In fact, it's often the case. Terrorists are trying to terrify by committing massive crimes against civilians. That's also a crime against humanity. So in the end, I would suggest skeptical of the idea of separate compartments. Instead, I think we have to just look at the definition of crimes against humanity, think about what's the purpose, what's the point, what's the essence of a crime against humanity, and then ask, does that apply here? And I think what a crime against humanity is serious crimes somehow linked to states or organizations, and they're widespread. It's not necessary to go into this detail that I've put here, but just so you know, inside the minds of international criminal lawyers, we've started to create two different boxes. One box is international criminal law. That's genocide, crimes against humanity. They've kind of become, now they're the most serious crimes, they're the core crimes. They get this special status. If the crime qualifies as one of those top three, all kinds of new rules. You get access to international courts, there's no immunity, there's no statute of limitations, there's universal jurisdiction, all these things flow. Then there's this other category that we would just call transnational crimes. Those are what we consider comparatively ordinary crimes, but they're crimes that have implications over borders. So for those ones, we encourage states to cooperate. So transnational crime are things like terrorism, organized crime, piracy, human trafficking, things like that. So among international lawyers, we've formed a habit now of thinking of these two things separately. But again, what I want to say is they don't have to be separate. Something could be organized crime and crime against humanity, that's possible. Or terrorism, if you think about in the United States with the attacks on September 11th, so that was terrorism, but it's also humanity. It's widespread, it's got 3,000 victims. It was very systematic, it was very carefully planned. They hijacked planes at the same time, carried out by an organization, Al-Qaeda, carried out. And so some people, there's a couple questions I guess one would ask then is, if you were looking at violence carried out by organized crime, by a drug cartel or something, there would be a legitimate question, well, their motives are economic, is that a crime against humanity? Do crimes against humanity have to be political? That's something we could discuss later. I think it doesn't matter why you're hurting civilians on a large scale. As long as you're hurting civilians on a large scale, I think that probably qualifies. I don't think crimes against humanity have to be political. Crime against humanity was slavery. It wasn't political, it was economic. There were these slaves picked up whoever they could. So I don't think the motives matter. Another thing complicated, especially for the international community, is sympathy for what the Mexican government is trying to do to fight the cartels. And say, well, the state's trying to do something worthy. And sure, the state has a worthy goal. But the question is, what are you doing in the pursuit of that worthy goal? If you're torturing people or doing things like that, then again, I don't think the motives matter. What matters is hurting civilians on a large scale. So that might be all I'll say about the compartments, and we'll leave that for discussion by the next group. Okay, so now there's this neat issue of, I mentioned that we have to show a state or organizational policy. So one question is, what's an organization? It's a funny question because it sounds technical, but what it brings out is, what is the essence of crimes against humanity? What are these crimes really about? There are things we know for sure. What qualifies states? We definitely, anything a state does, that can be a crime against humanity. We also know for sure, the translators that I said for sure. What we know for certain is that the acts of arms against humanity. But what about other groups? Thing which is open. It's different legitimate opinions, so maybe we'll have a chance to discuss this together. Political parties, what about terrorist organization? What about organized crime? What about corporations? Where's the line? This is the boundary of crime. This has come up in the International Criminal Court in the case in the. What happened in Kenya is there were these two political parties attacking all the people that might vote against them. Right? Which unfortunately happens. That's not just a Kenya, unfortunately. But they committed 1,000 murders. So the question is, can a political party be the type of organization that can commit a crime against humanity? The chamber, the three judges at the court that were looking at that question, they split over it. Judge Cowell from Germany in dissent, he thought no, political parties, it can't be a political party. He said it has to be a state-like organization. But the majority said no, it can be any organization as long as it has capacity to hurt people on a significant scale. Now, it's a good debate. Again, there's a lot to be said for both points of view. They have a lot of good arguments. But it's okay. Well, what have I done? Icons. Good. Okay. So it's a good debate, but that debate is sort of, I think it might be over. At the International Criminal Court, except for Judge Cowell, with this idea of just capacity. There's an argument on both sides. So Judge Cowell, the more conservative view, it has to be like a state. It makes sense, especially if you have a human rights lawyer background. Always looked at states. And so if that's your instinct to look, then state-like makes sense. And also Judge Cowell was worried. He didn't want to include biker gangs and all sorts of different. How low do we go with organization? What count? I'm not sure if biker gangs can commit crimes against humanity either, but maybe they could. I don't know. If a biker gang killed 1,000 people, I think that might be a crime against humanity. There's also a lot to be said in favor. I think they were just being criminal law to just always take the bigger, broader test to show how progressive you are. I don't think that was the case. I think it's a principled, okay decision. Layla Sadat, a professor from the United States, she calls this the modern concept. That the Cowell version was the traditional, and this is the modern. The modern concept recognizes that non-state actors in the world can do a lot of harm. Non-state actors are equally powerful as states, sometimes more powerful than states. So we have to acknowledge them. There's other arguments in favor of this broader test that will capture any non-state actor. One, historically, the first crime against humanity was just carried out largely by slavery arrangements. We want to capture them. The ordinary meaning of the word organization just means organization. It doesn't require state-like. It's just, are you organized? And they are. And there's another good reason is just the theory, the idea. There's an American academic named David Lubin. he came up with a neat idea of what is a crime against humanity. And he says, a crime against humanity, it's about our humanity in the sense that we are social animals, that we are part of what humans do. But when our habit of forming organizations turns harmful, that's what a crime against humanity is. So a crime against humanity is when our instinct to make this idea. So legitimate debate, maybe we'll have talks about that after in the next segment, but in law it's pretty settled that we're on to the capacity test. If human beings act through organizations and hurt a lot of people, then I think that's a crime against humanity. But it's something we can discuss. Like, there's perfectly legitimate views. Should terrorist organizations be covered? Should corporations be covered? Should organized crime be covered? That's up to you. Last is this terrible word, policy. So I put this little book with policy just to show, here's the problem with policy. It's just the word itself. The word itself, to most people, including unfortunately some ICC judges, the word itself, policy, implies formal, official, written, there's some ceremony, a board of directors has put a stamp on it, there's been some minutes, right? Is this the kind of bureaucratic idea? The bureaucratic concept with what I like, which is the organic concept. I have to confirm the opposition to policy because I had been these cases from the tribunals and older cases that said, yeah, policy, it's no big deal, it's this easy thing. And it made me not really understand what people were hearing when they heard the word policy. It's a term of art. It comes from this case called Tadic at the Yugoslav tribunal, which in turn drew from the international and things before that. And were somehow directed or encouraged by some state or organization. And that includes passive encouragement. If the states just sort of happen, that would be covered. It's not a bureaucratic idea. And in fact, they gave all kinds of clues in the cases. Policy does not have to be expressly stated. It doesn't have to be formalized. It's linked to the state or organization. And that's, again, that is to distinguish random individual crime. Just somehow link it to some situation. They've also said a policy doesn't have to implicate the top level of a state organization. It just has to be linked to it somewhere, but not necessarily the top level. The single most important point is you can infer the existence of policy just by looking at the crime patterns. Look at the facts and you can realize, I'll talk about how you infer it. It's obvious that this is organized behavior just from the facts on the ground. You don't need to go prove the secret meeting, the hidden document. You can just look and see, oh look, the keep rounding up certain kinds of people. That's not a mental crime. You can just see, in the case of the Nazis, of course, there were documents, but you don't need them. And these things I'm saying, I've made up. This is from the Tadic decision, which the Romans based on, and it's in a lot of jurisprudence, including a lot of Latin American jurisprudence. For those of you who might go on to do work in this area, I can provide. Unfortunately, some early cases of the ICC have taken what I call the route. And it's unfortunate because that means they're neglecting all of this transnational cases. So there was a case, the Bagbo adjournment decision. In the Bagbo case, I guess it was a similar story to the one I told before. Bagbo was the president, elections were coming. Forces working for Bagbo kept attacking people who would vote against Bagbo. And there was killings, assaults, sexual assaults, just physical assaults. And it was happening on a large scale, hundreds or over and over. Forces working for Bagbo attack people who might vote against Bagbo. Is that random crime just happening, or is that organized? I'll talk about some of the reasons to know it's organized. Oh, well, yeah. Well, I can't stop myself. So yeah, some of the arguments. So one is you can just look at the patterns. But then they also showed the police don't intervene when it happens. the police participate in the crimes. We can show evidence that the police prepared for the atrocities. So they would bring the tools they were going to use for the atrocities to the site. This is not accident. They're preparing. They took measures in advance to identify who the supporters were. All this was evidence submitted. They had public statements of the leaders declaring, we're going to attack people, blah, 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 right? And they had witnesses testifying to the things the perpetrators said during the attacks, which is, we're doing this to you because blah, blah, blah. That was the evidence brought. And to my dismay, the pretrial chamber said, well, that's not enough. We're not sure. We're not sure that's linked to a state organization. And the pretrial chamber sent the prosecutor away to say, go get better evidence. And particularly they asked, please go bring evidence of how, when, and by whom the alleged policy was adopted, including specific and how the plan disseminated to the forces. That is precisely how you're not supposed to do the policy element. That's exactly all the cases said is never required. You do not need to prove the meetings. You don't have to prove the dissemination. And it shows you that bureaucratic idea that it's like adopted at a meeting, written in the minutes. It's not how this happens. I was so sad about that. Again, they're sympathize with the ICC judges. They were just trying to be. I'm a judge. I've got this element. You have to prove a policy. And I, as a judge, be sure there was a policy unless the prosecutor to me the adoption of the policy. But the answer to that is we are proving the total implausibility of not policy. Do you see what I mean? The idea that all those police and forces, the idea that all that was a coincidence is ludicrous. That was not that was mental crime. That was planned, organized, right? So you show the policy, it's ludicrous that it's not the case. The thing is that's always been obvious to other courts other than the ICC. So I have some cases from, just two I just took just to give you examples from jurisprudence. A case in Peru, it says, look, the policy element only requires that the casual acts of individuals acting on their own in isolation with no one coordinating them is excluded. And so those common crimes, even if they're widespread, are not crimes against humanity unless you can at least show that they're tolerated by the organization. And then an Argentine case, famously, they looked at the whole system. In place, it was identical. The same things kept happening in place after place. So, and it was being carried out by state agents over and over. State agents over and over in all these places doing the same thing. The hypothesis that this could have occurred without express orders is discarded. And that's how you do it. You look and you just ridiculous that could have happened without the order. So that's how that's done. Later ICC cases have gone to the more mode now. So in the Bagbo decision, Judge Cowell from Germany joined the majority, and they said a lot of things about this policy element. Policy simply excludes spontaneous or isolated acts. It doesn't have to be formally adopted. If you have proof of planning, that's great. It's relevant, but it's not required. And we're going to look at these things like the kinds of acts and who was targeted and who was doing it and so on. And then another good case is Katanga, which is the court's ever second conviction. So Katanga said great things. Again, policy, not bureaucratic, does not have to be formal. It can evolve organically. One of my favorite things in the Katanga decision is that, of course, it would be really rare, as I've already said, but it would be to write down its plan to publish it, right? Like that's not, so stop, basically talking to the judges saying, stop looking for that because that's not what's going to happen. Of course, to infer policy after the fact, looking back at the evidence and so on. So that's bringing me towards my finish. So where do we stand right now? I guess if any of you are trying to collect information on it, it's important just to be aware there's a bureaucratic approach and there's an organic approach. As a matter of law, I think you should argue for the organic approach. I think the organic approach is winning. But as a matter of evidence collecting, you might as well collect all the evidence you can to meet even the bureaucratic standard. Again, I've already listed the kinds of evidence you should collect, but have I put this list? Doesn't need to be said, it's so obvious, but repetition, is it by the same, are they using the same methods over and over? Are they the same kinds of people over and over? Do you have evidence that they prepared? Stand by? Statements that the perpetrators made while they're doing it, we're doing this to you because blah, 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 that's evidence. And does it satisfy some kind of big organizational objective? Yeah, the policy element just boils down to, is some state organization behind it? Sincerely just a few. You have to be careful, by the way, in states or organizations, just a few rogue agents, because the number of rogue agents where you start to think, okay, this is indeed some sort of policy, but that's the situation. So I think I have a thought about, but I might save it for discussions later, because I don't like long lectures, I like short lectures. So I've made today, one is the basic concept, this idea of why systematic attack, and this is we talked about compartments. Should there be compartments? Is drugs one thing and crime against humanity thing be both? Third, we talked about this idea of, is it only state-like actors carrying out traditional forms of violence like in Nazi Germany, or is it, the fourth thing that I talked about was this idea of a policy element. What is it? Does it mean I have to prove secret documents, or is it enough just to say, hey, look, people from that organization kept doing it again and again, and that's enough. Yeah, and then we'll see, and this will be, if it can be labeled that, is that helpful? Is that constructive? And even that's kind of murky. One possibility is that applying the crime against humanity label might just further intensify national and international appeals for action. It could lead to the International Criminal Court opening up a preliminary examination, which then might in turn spur even stronger efforts by the Mexican government. So those are maybe the possible hope of why this legal issue turns out to be relevant. So I'll stop there. I spoke for 35 minutes, which was less than I think we were aiming for, but then we have more time to discuss a little bit. So thank you all very much.